Welcome to episode 6 of Radio Omnicor. I'm your host, Colleen Marcel, and I'm joined by my co-host, Marcel Harper.
Hi there.
How are you doing today, Marcel?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to our guest. It's going to be a good one.
Yeah, let's talk more about our guest who's coming up is Professor Prof Jansen. He is the ex-Vice-Chancellor and Rector of the University of the Free State. We've seen a lot of publicity about him going to Stanford University on fellowship. He's a multiple award-winning author, and in South Africa just has an amazing brand and presence in academia, and also prepared to speak out and speak his mind. And we're really thrilled to discuss further with him in studio today.
He's a real straight talker, and I think we're going to get some really good stuff from him. I mean, as an ex-academic myself, I know how politically complex academia can be. So I think if anyone's going to be able to give us some insights into leadership, it's going to be the professor.
As usual, you can find all our previous podcasts on iTunes and visit our website, www.omnicor.co.za/podcast. So, Prof, we are so thrilled to host you on our podcast, and the spirit of the podcast, I think, will resonate with your values, which are around teaching, making a difference in people's lives, and maybe just shaking up people's thinking a bit. And I think you're really good at doing that. So maybe if you can just start off talking a little bit about your idea around Tarzan leadership versus your heart-centered leadership that you really seem to hold by.
Yeah, I've always been sort of amused and sometimes irritated by the popular notions of leadership, that you find in boardrooms and even in books, of the what I call the strongman theory of leadership. That you really need some very muscular guy up there who takes charge of things and turns the company on its head and moves from deficits into profit. I find those things not just misleading, but really, unhelpful as a way of talking about and doing leadership in the 21st century. So for me, leadership is not about the big man. We know from research and from practice that leadership is never one person. It's always a whole lot of people bound together in a set of networks. And that the CEO or the Vice-Chancellor or the head of the NGO is, at the end of the day, dependent on, and very much inspired by the leadership plural that emanates from these networks of people, of ideas, and so on. So for me, that's real, and that's much more descriptive of what actually happens in the leadership of a small or even a very large organization. So that's the first thing to be clear about. Leadership is a plural term. And that is ethically appropriate, but it is also empirically correct. You lead through others and because of others and with others and alongside others. And that notion of leadership is something I also feel very comfortable about. Then having said that, I also don't believe that leadership is about the issuing of commands, of the big guy sitting in a control tower and saying, here's the script for the day and go and do he likewise. That is, of course, not going to get you very far in the democracy, at least. So for me, what I have enjoyed doing is to lead not just with the head, because you do need the head to get a rational sense of what is to be done, but to also lead with the heart, which is to listen very, very carefully to not just what people say, but what they find difficulty in articulating or putting into words. And this is not about language capacity. This is about the fact that the people who work for you and with you and alongside you are not only bodies. These are people who carry with them hurt and memory, who carry with them, in their biographies, certain kinds of expectations, certain things they've learned not to say or to avoid, certain kinds of pains that are very difficult to bear, and that they keep to themselves, and certain kinds of ambitions, things they want to be and do and say and become. And those are not simply cognitive, kinds of constructs. Those are also very much emotional realities. And so a big job of a leader is to listen to those kinds of things and to respond not just, with a performance-based contract, but also with a sense of accommodation, a sense of inclusion, a sense of recognition, a sense of empowerment, and so on. So when a new employee comes to see me in our university, I would conclude a discussion, hello, and who are you kind of discussion with. By the time you leave here, you've got to be a better person. You've got to have more qualifications. You've got to have a stronger sense of yourself. Now, of course, that's very difficult to guarantee in an organization with 37,000 students and with thousands of employees. But I still think that is the ideal, that you want to put in the minds of the people you are privileged to serve. And that is a sense that if this place doesn't make you a better person, a more fulfilled worker, a more ambitious, a professional, then it would have failed you, in fact, regardless of what the specific outputs or outcomes are expected from your contract.
Right. So, Prof, in preparing for this exciting highlight in my life personally, many people said, why is the Prof leaving? And obviously you had said that was your plan all along, but it's a great loss for South Africa, and we'd just love to hear a little bit more about your journey ahead and what you hope to maybe bring back to South Africa ultimately.
Yeah, no, so, first of all, I've never really worked in a job for longer than 7 years. So if you look at my track record, I've seldom stayed for less than 7 years, but I've seldom stayed on for longer than 7 years, because in my head, I've always made the calculation that if you're going to make an impact, do it in 7 years, and then let somebody else take over for the next phase, and so on. So I'm comfortable leaving after 7 years, but I'm not leaving the country. I'm going for a year to California, and then I'm coming back. Now, the one thing I know about myself, and I think this is also something that leaders should embrace, the notion of sustainable leadership. In this job that I serve, most of the time I'm giving. You're giving up your time, you're giving up your energy, you're giving up your resources, you're giving up your physical space at home, and so on. So you, in my 18-hour day, I often feel exhausted at the end of the day because I put a lot of energy into this very exciting job. The problem with that, of course, is that, like any element in the ecosystem, or any species in the ecosystem, if you give, you've got to replenish, you've got to replace, So I really do see this effectively 9 months, not even a whole year, the 9 months of the American academic year, is really an opportunity to replenish energy, to, get the batteries going up again, and then to come back with a bang after that, to continue to do the work that I've always done, which is to improve the educational fortunes of children in schools, of young people at universities, and so on and so forth. So, so while I'm leaving, I'm coming back, and after a short period, to do exactly what I tell people to do in any given year. For example, I do about easily 120, 130 talks around the country. That's excluding overseas, right? And every single one of those talks, as anybody will attest, that has attended one of them, ends with a message of hope. It always ends with a sense of, now, what can we do better? How can we save our country? How can we be countercultural in the face of, for example, growing racism or increasing poverty and inequality and so on? It is about hope. Now, of course, I can't leave the country in a permanent sense. If my message of hope says that, we're in this together and we've got to keep pushing and pushing back and making sure that this beautiful country of ours continues to live up to the dream of 1994. So I haven't given up on that. I see huge challenges ahead, obviously, in our politics and in our education. About that, I've also been very clear. But I also have seen enough of the goodness of people, enough of the passion of young people, enough of the optimism of people who don't have any reason to be optimistic, to know that we will still turn this country around.
Prof, I mean, I'm quite interested. I used to be an academic myself, and I also followed your 7-year plan as I was thinking of my own biography. And, I mean, you must have learned a wealth of things about tertiary education, how to run an academic institution, and how it connects up with this goal you have of improving people's fortunes. I mean, now looking back when you're about to depart this role, what are some of the lessons you take to heart in, maybe things you perhaps were naive about when you started this role, and now looking back as an experienced person in the role?
Yeah.
I'm really interested to know what you take from that.
I'm happy to share that. So the first and most important lesson that I've learned is that we have in our young people an incredible capacity for greatness. Now, this is not a Miss World kind of speech, right? This is like true. This is actually true. So let me just give you a simple example. When I got to the University of the Free State, our pass rate was in the low 60s. It was the second lowest in the country at the time. Just by doing a few things that affirmed, the capacity and the potential of our young people, we're now one of the 3 highest in the country. We're 82% this year, and it's going to grow to 85% by next year, I believe.
Massive improvement.
How does this happen? It's very, very simple. You, first of all, set the standard high. So instead of bringing into university the horrific standards of our school system, which is 30%, 40% passes, math literacy, all that nonsense, that I rail against in my Times column. We set the standard very high, and we said, we expect you to do well because we know you can do well. Now, for me, this is not sort of some kind of, motivational cause based on nonsense, This for me is my own biography. So I know that I wasn't very smart. At least I didn't think I was very smart. And I know that because 1 or 2 or 3 people really took you seriously, I was able to do exceptionally well. So the issue is not, the capacity of our young people. The issue is, do we really believe that they have it within them to become, leading professionals, whether it's in commerce and banking, or whether it is in industry, the private sector, whether it is in education or the NGO world, whether it is in politics or in civil society. I really do believe that the biggest, I've taught American kids and I've taught South African kids. You know what the big difference is?
What?
But first of all, let me tell you what is the same. Is they're exactly the same as human beings. But when I teach in a group of American kids, they all tell you exactly how they're going to change the world. When I teach South African kids, they start off by telling you how disadvantaged they are, or how, limited their visions are, and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with our young people. So whether I've taught high school in rural South Africa or I've taught university in the big cities, I've always started off with the notion that you can really do great things. So that for me, I always knew that intellectually, but to be able to see it, among students who became Rhodes Scholars, among students who became, global leaders in our university, to be able to see it in the past grade, to be able to see things that the people in the Free State never thought was possible in our university now happening, is a wonderful affirmation of what I've already believed, that there is nothing wrong with our young people. Give them the opportunity, teach them well, inspire them by your example, and I tell you now, things change. Now, what is true for education is true for the economy. What is true for the economy is true for politics. And if we only set the bar high for performance, I'm telling you now, this can be the greatest country on earth. So for me, that is something I've experienced and that I've learned. That's lesson number one that I've taken away from our university experience.
And that's very powerful. I mean, as I listen to you, it's almost as though we've come to expect in South Africa a bit of a story of failure rather than success. If you contrast the American kids to the South African kids, it's more around having an expectation of success and driving that forward.
And that has happened to me often, because I've studied in both countries. So the example that I often use is whenever I do a huge audience talk in South Africa, I would say, and this goes across color and class, I would say to the audience of 500 people, raise your hand if when you went to university, a professor said something like this: welcome to Biochemistry 359. By the end of the first semester, half of you will be gone. You know what happens? Almost every hand in the audience goes up. They recognize a professor who taught them that they would fail before he even opened his mouth. So how on earth can you build a competitive culture? How on earth can you inspire young people, to compete out of their socks if your opening line in a class or in your home or in your church or in your synagogue is this notion that, you should be happy with less. And so I think that's our biggest problem. This is the only country in the world that I know of where our politicians boast about how little they know. They boast about how little schooling they have. What nonsense is that?
It's not a badge of honor.
How can you communicate the message down the system? That's why they burned schools in Wuhan. Is that the message is to really, really get ahead. You don't need education. You don't need the formal, training and so on and so forth. So I think we're in a rut, but I think we can get out of it. And that's going to just require a different kind of leadership.
I was about to ask you that. I mean, I think implied in your message is we're in a rut, but we can get out of it. But how do we get out of it?
Yeah, no, we can easily get out of this, and you see, part of our dilemma is we place so much faith in political leadership. That is to say, we recognize government and governmental leadership as the only way in which you can chart a different path. But think about it. Think about leaders in business and industry. Think about leaders in schools and colleges. Think about leaders in your home. Just the many different ways in which all of us have a leadership role, So, with my own children, for example, they would often remind me that I tell them often that the Jansens aren't very smart people, which is true. But I say to them, you do mathematical literacy and I take you out of the world. So,
did that motivate them?
And guess what? They did well,
Yes.
And so being aspirational, in a family where neither my wife or I had anybody who really, in our parents' generation went to university and so on and so forth. And today there's 20, 30 degrees in a family of 4, And the reason that happens is very simple. My starting point in family life is you're great. You can do wonderful things. You can. And so just imagine every kid woke up in the morning and their mother or father would say to them, guess what? I really believe you're the smartest kid in your class. I really believe you can do great things. Just imagine every teacher refused to divide kids up into ability groups and say you're the smart group and you're the weak group. Do you know how often that happens in our country? So this notion of judging, this notion of categorizing, this notion of deciding before you've given a person a fair chance, who can and who cannot, is at the heart of our dilemma. And that means a leadership at all these levels I spoke about that can change this country. And that, by the way, is the only message that I have when I hit the road in the 9 provinces, is change your expectations about the people that you serve, whether it is my staff in the university, or whether it's my parishioners in the church, or whether it is my children in the home. Change your expectation frames of what people can do, and guess what? They respond.
So, Prof, I know that transformational leadership is really a passion of yours. And just a question, in our context, living in South Africa, we often come across racist comments just in passing. And how does one actually handle that? Because I tend to just get really aggressive, and that doesn't always work. But I feel a lot of the conversational racism isn't addressed. And what is the better way to perhaps deal with that ignorance?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to make sure that our own language as parents, I always start at the foundations. Where do kids learn the racial attitudes first? 9 out of 10 in their homes, okay? 9 out of 10. So the comment a parent makes, in relation to the domestic worker, just think about that. And talking to the domestic worker who's your age or older, by his first name, which, as you know, in South African culture is not cool. And so children pick up, about race and hierarchy and what's appropriate and not appropriate, and who gets to speak and who doesn't, and who eats out of the big plate, and who can only use condensed milk and apricot jam. So kids are remarkably alert to the subtle ways and sometimes the very open ways in which we discriminate as parents, as teachers, etc. So for me, if you're going to change this country, you can't wait. And this is why I always am amused when people sort of expect a university to transform every single kid after 18 years of, poison put into their heads. It's very, very difficult. Now, so that's the first thing. Change the way we should. If you just look at Donald Trump, for example, in this other country that I'm going to, and just the incredible racism that this man with a public platform, issues every single day. Just imagine that kind of hatred towards black people, towards Mexicans, towards,
women,
people with disabilities, etc. And that then energizes a whole lot of right-wing people, a whole lot of racist people, etc. So we have a responsibility, whether you're a small leader or a big leader, to mind your language, to watch how you speak, etc., etc. But that's only one side of the argument. The other side is, of course, we also need to be more resilient in the face of racism. This country got into this mess over 350 years. Anybody that tells you that our universities and our courts and our businesses are suddenly going to become non-racial spaces in our lifetime, they're lying to you. It's not going to happen. So the transformation for me is hard work. You get your heart broken 1 million times, and you keep pushing on and pushing on and pushing on. And provided we go 2 steps forward and only 1 back, we're in a good space. But transformation is not a linear journey. It is a back and forth. And our job as leaders is to make sure that the overall momentum is always forward. But we also need to build a resilience within ourselves. When a really silly woman on the South Coast makes a racist statement on Facebook about black people and the Durban beaches, you know what? That's hurtful, of course, and that's horrible. But you could swear that this country was going to fall apart, and so you had what psychologists call a moral panic, about this unknown woman on the South Coast and a Facebook posting. No. I think we're bigger than that and we're larger than that. And, the one thing I learned from people like Steve Biko in those days of black consciousness is there's a certain kind of pride that you have. There's a certain kind of fortitude. There's a certain kind of, you can't do me any harm regardless, of what you say. And so I don't want us to walk around with these thin skins, and every time somebody looks at you, you call them names, I want to find a way in our social system, in our education system in particular, in which we can build a resilience among people so that we can speak back, speak with authority, take action, but not collapse, every time this happens. Having said that, I can tell you now without a shadow of a doubt, because I've been on farms in the Free State and in the Eastern Cape after the farmer's wife was killed, okay? I've been in townships after a horrific tragedy in which people were killed. I have been there week after week in these 7 years. And let me tell you, the majority of the people of this country are decent. They're not, they don't seek retaliation. They want this country to work. And so I don't look at the people on the fringes to define South Africa. I look at the huge majority in the middle and say, how do we work with them? And let me just say one more thing about this. We must also get out of this notion that it's either black people win or white people win, the zero-sum game. I don't think we need to go down that route. I've been in Bloemfontein now 7 years, and one of the challenges of living in the central region with a small airport is you have to fly on these very small airplanes every day. And let me tell you, if you lacked any sense of religious faith, flying on those small planes would bring you very near to God, because every landing is a reportable incident. But anyway, when I first got here, the only voices I heard were white pilots, and they were all men. Then I had white male pilots and white female pilots. And then I would occasionally hear a black guy with the captain of the flight. Now it's not unusual to have two black people or two black women fly. It's absolutely amazing. But the other day, I saw a wonderful picture. Excuse me. I heard this white pilot speak when we took off, and then I heard this black woman speak when she was flying from Joburg to Bloemfontein. And I was so thrilled at the image in my head that when the plane landed, I said to the air hostess, would you mind opening up the door to the cockpit? I'd like to take a photo of these two people. And here was this older white guy, and here was this young black woman. And I said to them, I want to take your picture. And they posed, and I took the picture. What is it about that picture that I find so moving? Well, first of all, here's the older white guy. Yeah, he got his skills and his competence and his flying history probably on the basis of the fact that he was white and man and so on from the old country.
Sure.
But instead of pushing him away, we say to him, we need those skills. You're going to train this young black woman because she needs to fly a certain number of hours before she can, also sit on the other side of the cockpit. That is the South Africa we should work towards, where we use the best of our skills, black and white, pull it together, transfer training and competence, and make sure that for all of us, there's a place in the sun. That's the kind of South Africa that I think Nelson Mandela fought for, and that is the kind of South Africa, the kind of university, the kind of, private company, the kind of government office that I think we should create and sustain.
So Prof, what we're really passionate about here is learning and changing behavior and coaching. And I'm interested to hear, what are the ways in which you can change behavior? What is the motivation for change that needs to be apparent in the person being coached? Any views on that?
Being coached. Okay. My experience is, and we've started a whole lot of coaching type programs during my 7 years here, one for young academics who want to become professors, another, all of these things, mentorship for change programs with students and so on and so forth. Now, the one and perhaps obvious thing is people really get excited when you take an interest in their own lives, right? So you'll be surprised how many people lack guidance, lack direction, so I wish somebody had taken me as a young PhD student or graduate and told me that this is how you become a professor. Nobody did that. I learned that by, trial and error. So being able to sit down with somebody, and I have enormous, I didn't know how to do this, but a huge number of people for whom I am now a mentor. And I've now had to take on people as electronic mentors. Send me your CV, tell me what you want to do, let me tell you about how you get there, do you know these networks? People really enjoy getting direct coaching about their life and about their careers and about their ambitions. So I quite enjoy it, and especially with young academics, I've sort of learned a lot about how to do that well, and it's been a joy, an absolute joy, to be able to see. I also did a lot of mentoring and coaching around writing, and a number of our undergraduate students have now written books as a result of that, and those books are in the marketplace. So yeah, I think there's a great joy a great kick that I get out of being able to sit with someone and say, you know what, I might not have had this when I was a young person, but it is my responsibility, with the privilege one has been afforded, to make sure that I can give you guidance on your life and your career. So that's an easy thing to do, I think, and people really appreciate the investment of time and energy and the belief. This is more than just giving people skills. This is giving people a sense of self-belief that they can do stuff.
Sure.
And I enjoy that.
Prof, I wanted to just quickly go back to the very first topic we spoke of in terms of leadership. I'm quite interested to know what your views are on how do we actually break through this sort of appeal the strongman leader tends to have in people's minds. It clearly is there because it appeals to people. So how do we kind of move beyond that?
Yeah, so I'm a great believer in the power of leadership that is demonstrated, that is, not doing workshops on leadership and saying here are the 7 steps to greatness or that kind of nonsense. I really believe that people believe you when they see in your leadership. So I have an open door policy, for example. People have come through my office who worked here for 30 years who had never been in the Vice-Chancellor's office. I find that very hard to believe, but it's true. So the first thing is to give people a sense that leadership is about openness. Leadership is about being accessible. And so one of the reasons I'm very active, as you know, with more than 80,000 now followers on Twitter, Facebook, and the like, is because I wanted to give people a sense that you can access your leaders in the real time.
Right. And
so on. So it's always nice for me when people say to me, you're the first person that I've met that answers all the emails on the same day. and in fact, if I'm not in a meeting, I'll answer it in the same minute. So what I'm trying to say is people won't believe that leadership is down to earth, leadership is accessible. My office, unlike many vice-chancellors, is on the ground floor of the building. Why? Because you must be able to walk in here, and be able to come and talk to me if I'm available. So no amount of training and books and seminars is going to convey that sense of leadership as being on the ground, than if you demonstrated that through the power of the example. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you must demonstrate, especially men, because we're not good at this, that leadership is vulnerability. That is, that you're conscious all the time of your humanity, that you make mistakes, that you can say sorry, that you can, not convey the sense of being in control all the time, but to convey a sense of being, subject to any number of things over which you have no control. So being able to cry for me is a very important part of my leadership, being able to feel the emotion and stress of a colleague who's just lost a father, like today, for example, this morning in one of my meetings, and being able to reach out and hug and say a prayer, So when a student came to my office on my birthday and said, and came in with a bowl of water and a towel and some soap, as a not so good Christian, I knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to wash my feet on the birthday. Now think about that. That doesn't happen because this young woman on her own thought this was a good idea. This happens because of a series of things that my colleagues and I did to create an environment in which leadership is seen as serving rather than simply, lording over other people's lives. So I think our biggest challenge, whether it's raising kids or leading in organizations, is that people don't believe us because they don't see in your life an example of what it means to lead in a way that is empathetic, that is humble, that is open to being wrong, and that is persistent around certain values that are important to you as a leader. If we did more of that, then I think it would be much easier to lead. So I give in any given month, I know that about half of my salary goes back to students. And I'm happy to do that. I mean, it causes, as you can imagine, a bit of alarm at home. But for me, it is very, very important to give people the sense that leadership is about giving rather than taking, serving rather than, instructing, and loving rather than being indifferent. And that's something that I try to share every day with my colleagues.
Thanks for that.
So we're going to wrap up now, Prof, and I think that the story you've just ended with there really reminds me of Nelson Mandela. I had the opportunity to nurse him, and the thing that stood out for me was on night duty when we would come in, and he was sick. I mean, he was a patient in the ward. He would stand up and greet us and get out of bed, and I always use that example when speaking to young people around respect and that sense of availability and generosity. And I just think that really wraps up you in a way. And we're all very grateful to all the effort that you put into our country and the transformation. And hopefully you'll be able to connect with you in America and do a podcast while you're there.
Or better still, come over there and spend a few days.
Wow, that's a brilliant idea.
We'll definitely take you up on that.
And we will put links into the show notes to your books and your profile and let you know when the recording is ready for release.
All right.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Prof.
Good luck, you guys.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
I'm really excited today to introduce Doublethink, Marcel. This is the place where you have fun with all your biases and interesting psychological theories. And what are you going to tell us today? What are we going to learn today?
Well, I mean, there's so many different things to pick from when it comes to cognitive biases and thinking about thinking, which really is the field of study I most enjoy. I was thinking today to cover a really interesting bias identified by two researchers by the name of Kruger and Dunning. And as a result, it's called the Kruger-Dunning effect. And it's a fascinating one. I think we all experience it almost every day. And you can see it in a lot of different places in business and in life. So I think we'll go into and delve a little bit deeper into the Kruger-Dunning effect and see how it might affect our listeners in their everyday life.
That sounds amazing.
Cool. So let's get started. The basics of the Kruger-Dunning effect is that competence is something which is both a thing you do and a thing you know. So in other words, competent people are competent at knowing how competent they are. A lot of competence there. And so incompetent people, by logical extension, don't know how incompetent they are. So one of the most clear examples I can think of to illustrate the Kruger-Dunning effect is if you look at professional sports people or athletes. So I don't know if you've ever watched golf, Colleen. Do you ever watch golf by sheer accident on television?
Yeah, probably sheer accident.
Okay, so if you look at, I like watching golf for observing the Kruger-Dunning effect amongst many other psychological effects, but the Kruger-Dunning is particularly obvious from professional golf. So if you compare a professional golfer and an amateur, So if you go to your local driving range or local golf course and you see amateurs play golf, or if you yourself might happen to be an amateur golfer, you'll notice a very distinct difference in the way they finish their shot and what they do after having played a shot. So if you watch someone like Tiger Woods or any other famous golfer, Rory McIlroy or is it Jessica Wu, I'm not too sure, and they play a shot, you'll notice that they almost immediately know whether it was a good or a bad shot. So they won't have to look up from the shot to know if it was a good shot or not. So when Tiger Woods plays a bad shot, you can see it in his face the moment he strikes the ball. And he often just walks away from the shot without even looking where the ball's going. Now, part of that is because he has a caddy who's being paid to look after where that shot's going, but actually he knows where that shot's going. He knows it's going in the rough or in the trees or in the water, because he has the competence of understanding completely how good a shot he just played or bad a shot. So part of becoming an expert in something is also understanding your own limitations and understanding the boundaries of your competence. So it's a sort of a meta competence which hovers above whatever you're really good at and is able to give you feedback as to what you're doing right or wrong. And that's why professional golfers can become as good as they are, or any expert or professional, is that natural feedback cycle they've got in their brain keeps on telling them how to improve. And even though they sometimes have coaches and people who help them, they can mostly do it on their own after a certain level. So watch that again. If you watch professional sport, and it's pretty golf is a more obvious one because of the dynamic of golf, that it's a shot and then you have to go sort of see where the ball goes. So it's very rare for professional golfers, or any professional athlete for that matter, to not be aware of the mistakes they made. It's part of their professionalism, part of their competence to know that. In contrast, if you go and watch amateurs do their thing, so if you see an amateur golfer at the driving range, for instance, they will often look at where they've hit the shot. They're very interested to know where the shot went because they're not sure where it went. And they're often not aware of what they did wrong. And hence the frustration which comes in with being an amateur golfer or an amateur anything. There's a great deal of frustration you have to get past in order to become an expert at something, and that frustration is often about not knowing what I'm doing wrong. And that's why people pay for golf lessons and for music lessons, so that the professional will immediately know what you did wrong. So if I'm taking guitar lessons and I make some horrible mistake, my professional guitar tutor can immediately tell what I did. They don't have to think about it. They'll say it's because you did X. But if I had to try and figure it out on my own as an amateur, it's going to take me much longer. So that's the core of the Kruger-Dunning effect, is the notion that to be good at something includes the knowledge of how good you are. Now, it's got some very interesting consequences, but I've interrupted your question.
I have a question. So in coaching, this comes up a lot, where executives come in for leadership coaching, and self-esteem is the blind. It's blinding this ability to know self. So how does that play into?
Well, I'm not too sure about self-esteem, but the second part of your question makes a lot of sense from the Kruger-Dunning effect's perspective, and that is that blinding to the self. One of the key consequences of the Kruger-Dunning effect in everyday life is that, and this is what the researchers really did research on, is to see how accurate are people in judging their own competence at something. And they found that highly competent people are very accurate at judging their competence. So if they are given a task which is very difficult, and even when they make mistakes, they know exactly what mistakes they've made. So they have a very, very clear picture of the limits of their competence. Incompetent people, so in other words, a person who's incompetent at something, we don't want to generalize, I don't think there are anybody is truly universally incompetent. But if you're incompetent at a thing, you often don't know how incompetent you are at it.
Or maybe less experienced.
Or less experienced,
yeah.
Sure. But basically, if you lack competence in something, you don't know how much competence you lack. And what's more, and this is the second part of the Kruger-Dunning effect, which is so interesting, is incompetent people tend to overestimate their competence. That's the most important part. So if I'm not good at something, I tend to completely overestimate my ability at it versus someone who is very competent at it. So now that's got a lot of correlates in normal life and in business. And that is why we have to be skeptical, for instance, about self-reported competence. if someone tells me how good they are at something, I tend to be somewhat skeptical of it, given that I know about the Kruger-Dunning. Because it's highly likely that they're overestimating their competence. Not always, but it's one of the consequences of knowing about the effect.
I think we see that a lot in the 360 reviews that we do in coaching. And often before the coaching starts, people come in and they are scoring themselves almost full marks for everything. And for me, the success of the coaching is when that does align more with the other people in the review nominees, because then it suddenly comes down to what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's so many other correlates as well. For instance, we find the Kruger-Dunning effect especially prevalent amongst younger people, because by virtue of the fact that they're just not as experienced, they haven't been alive for that long. And so you'll often find adolescents, for instance, tend to really overestimate their abilities in many different things. So the Kruger-Dunning effect is very strong in them. And it takes them a long time to understand the limits of their competence. The other part, which is dangerous, I guess, in business especially, is that if you overestimate your ability in something, you're more likely to be overconfident in that thing. And if you're overconfident in doing something, you may very well make larger mistakes than if you were less confident. Overconfident people take on more responsibility, they risk more, because they think they've got it covered. They've got it handled. But they don't. And that is the risk of the Kruger-Dunning effect in business especially. It's also frustrating, because if you're dealing with people who continually overestimate their abilities, it obviously creates a lot of interpersonal frustration in business. It creates a lot of problems in business relationships. So it's got a variety of knock-on effects, I think, which are negative for people who experience the Kruger-Dunning.
So if you were working with somebody who you could see is in the situation of overestimating themselves, maybe not incompetent, but just not really displaying good self-awareness, how would you, because are they open to feedback?
Well, you see, that's the other thing. I mean, the Kruger-Dunning effect suggests that people are not aware of how competent they really are until they reach a certain level of competence. So true experts kind of know the limits of their knowledge and their abilities. That's why you often find that, and that's what the researchers also found, highly competent people tend to underestimate their abilities because they know how much they don't know. If you talk to a person who's a well-regarded expert on a topic, they will often tell you in the first few sentences how little they think they know about the topic, and that comes across as being modest or humble. But it's not often the case that they are trying to be modest or humble. It's the Kruger-Dunning effect suggests that they just really know the limitations of their knowledge. To be an expert at a topic, you must know the full breadth of the topic. And often you know then that I can never know everything about this thing. Where if you're a novice and you think you've got it covered, you often overestimate your knowledge and you think, I know everything about this topic. I am the expert. There's nothing you can tell me about it. So there is a certain inherent closedness to feedback and to modification, which the researchers also found in people who are not competent at a particular thing. So it's interesting how the Kruger-Dunning effect has a bit of a self-perpetuating effect where people are closed to trying to improve. So it can be really problematic. If you're a manager and you notice that a colleague of yours or a subordinate of yours consistently gets something wrong, but they claim to be really good at it, it can be a massive trial for you to convince them that they're not that good. Because in their mind, according to the Kruger-Dunning effect, and it happens quite unconsciously, like most of these cognitive biases we speak of, in their mind, they believe they're pretty good at it.
So would it help to give specific examples, or would they still refute those?
Well, that seems to be one of the few ways you can change it, is sort of to give people constant feedback, to say, well, here's another event which didn't quite measure up, and here's why it didn't measure up, or here's what you did wrong. So it's constant feedback, it's constant sort of picking away at the edifice of, unconscious error which they're committing. And also just to gain competence, of course. So if you actually get trained in something and you practice something, you will naturally accrue that knowledge of the limits of your own competence. But you have to be open to wanting to enter some sort of mentorship relationship or some kind of apprenticeship. And I think maybe, and this is sort of anecdotal, I can't say that I know of any existing studies which show this, but I would imagine the Kruger-Dunning effect is one of the reasons why we often have very structured programs of training. in the professions, especially where you have an apprenticeship. And throughout human history, there's always been this thing where there's an apprenticeship to some kind of profession. And maybe that sort of structured apprenticeship is pretty good at subverting the Kruger-Dunning effect over time. But you're not going to do it in a once-off shot. If you tell someone who's not good at something that they're not good at it, they're very likely not to believe you.
So now, is this an age thing? Is this around the older you get, just by experience, you're going to become more competent?
I would expect so, and I think that's why we see it, like I said, younger people tend to have a much more pronounced Kruger-Dunning display. And if any of our listeners have ever tried to, argue with an adolescent about how they're not competent at something, it's almost like, not really worth the effort. And I think it's because their brain has a specific, interesting confluence of, for the first time ever, really understanding how their mind works and being able to think about their own thinking, plus the Kruger-Dunning effect, which is persistent throughout human psychology. And so those two things kind of come together in the perfect storm where they really overestimate themselves in almost everything.
And take a lot of risks.
They take a lot of risks. Their brain is geared towards it. So it's kind of weird. And you find, especially, for instance, when young people, and there's a reason why, for instance, insurance companies load younger people heavier when they drive. It's because they take more risks. But they're also unaware of how dangerous their behavior is. The Kruger-Dunning effect, again, suggests they're going to overestimate their competence at something they haven't actually had a lot of practice in, which is driving. And so even if they have a lot of accidents, they'll still believe quite strongly that they're a good driver, that they're advanced, they know what they're doing. And I would imagine that sort of dissipates with age. But it's always there. It's the hallmark of expertise. And there's a whole field in psychology studying expertise and why experts do things differently from novices. And the Kruger-Dunning effect is definitely at the core of the way experts think about their own thinking.
So do you remain incompetent then, even after time and more self-awareness? At what point are you just going to be incompetent? It's not the Kruger-Dunning effect.
So part of becoming competent is understanding how you become competent, understanding the mechanisms which you activate as you learn a new skill or a new knowledge. And I think that's the key behind it. You can't actually become really good at something unless you have a structured way of learning that thing, or if you practice it a lot and you become more aware of what you're doing wrong and what you need to improve on. And I think that's the key. That is why people are really good at something tend to not overestimate their abilities, because in becoming good at it, they've learned exactly how this thing which they're trying to master works. They know the mechanics.
Is that almost a signal of, okay, now the fact that I'm becoming a little bit more cautious about being the guru is a sign that...
I would think so. I think the caution with which you approach your topic of expertise or your ability and the level of modesty you approach it with might be a sign of your expertise in it.
So and it's not self-doubt. It's not...
No, I don't think it's self-doubt. I think it's a very accurate understanding of the limits of your capacity and also the difficulty of the task. I mean, again, if you listen to interviews with professional athletes, we'll use golf now as the persistent example. Often when they have the post-mortem interview with someone who won a major championship, it's interesting to see how they firstly remember almost every shot they took in that final round, and they go into an excruciating detail on every shot. It's a bit boring to listen to. And they will often say, yes, on hole 16, I really lost it, and I pulled that shot into the water, and that wasn't great, and I really had to consolidate things, and I had to play more conservatively from that point onwards. And you get the impression that they understand how difficult it is to win a major tournament. They very rarely will say to the interviewer, oh, it was easy. I could have won this tournament with my hand tied behind my back. You do, however, hear that sort of thing a lot from people who are not very good at something. There's a lot of boasting going on, a lot of over judgment of ability. And so, I think that part of the maturation process and understanding how to become good at something is also understanding how difficult it is to become good at something.
So what pops into my mind is Muhammad Ali. From the get-go, he was just so clear around his competence. There was just no room for, was that...
Sure, but he wasn't always that good in boxing. So that's an interesting point, is, you know, the Kruger... So that's why I think the Kruger-Dunning effect is a little bit independent from traditional views of modesty or arrogance. I think it has some interaction with those things, but it's also somewhat independent. That it's more about actually mastering the thing itself, which has a direct effect on the Kruger-Dunning effect. And that's why novices at anything are much more prone to overestimating their abilities.
So how can we use this in our daily life? I'm just thinking sometimes with clients, they propose a solution that's not always a good fit.
Yes. I think a number of things. I think if you're working with young people in business, you should understand the Kruger-Dunning effect, and that it's very likely to affect the way they understand themselves and the way they describe their own behavior to you. So you've got to be cautious if young, inexperienced people want to take on too much, or if they report back to you and it just seems too good to be true. Might very well be too good to be true. So that's the one thing. I think if you work with young people in that way. On the other hand, for ourselves, we should be a little bit more skeptical about things we think we're really good at. If you have some belief in your head that you're particularly good at something, and maybe you don't really know why, maybe just have this real gut feeling that I am just brilliant at this thing, it could be wrong. You could maybe be under the spell of the Kruger-Dunning effect, especially if you haven't necessarily put in the time and effort to become good at that thing. So normally if that comes out when people think they're naturals at something. Now, of course, anyone who's watched The Idols or any shows like that will see how many people, when they interview those singers, we call them singers lightly, before they go on stage, they'll often say, no, my friends and family have always told me I'm really good, and I just think I'm a natural singer. I'm a natural entertainer. And then they go on to camera and they're horrible. And I think that's a good sign, that obviously they think there's some inherent expertise. But we know from the way human performance works that very few things are inborn to the extent that you can just go and do that thing like an expert. No one's born anything, really. It takes hard effort.
Good. So those are some very useful ways that we can... I've got some people in mind as you speak of how I need to operate more carefully around them, and myself. And I think the whole 360 review process that we enter into, it makes a lot more sense in terms of the self-rating.
Absolutely.
How you can make sense of that for people.
Absolutely. I think that's the key. You know, it's not an easy thing to overcome, but I think if you're more aware of it, you're less likely to be under its spell, either as the person, him or herself, or when you're dealing with other people who may be subject to the Kruger-Dunning effect.
Great. Thanks, Marcel. That was
absolute pleasure.
Fabulous.
Please send through any of your questions or comments on the podcast page on our website, omnicor.co.za/podcast. And don't forget to rate us on iTunes. It really helps. Subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends. Thanks to our producer, Matt Bezeling. And a shout out to someone very special in the heart of Omnicor, James Ashton, listening into the podcast all the way from Malta. Thank you for everything, James. He's the guy who started it all. And we're thinking of you.